Welcome to the Praxis Report. This is your host, Jonathan Brown.
And I'm your co-host, William Barth.
In today's episode, we're going to discuss the culture wars in America. And of course, by culture war, we're referring to the political conflicts between liberals and conservatives that have polarized American society over the last several decades around issues like abortion, gun rights, multiculturalism, pornography, gay rights, death penalty, and anything that's sort of related to lifestyle, morality, and things of that nature. And this is, of course, a very big issue because the election that's coming up in November is focused on primarily cultural issues by the Democratic Party, while they want to focus away from issues such as inflation, the economy, the war, etc. So what we're going to try to do is kind of bring a politics back into the discussion of culture and look at the culture wars from a materialist perspective and add a little bit of a Marxian discussion to the way that we think of culture.
Yeah, and John, that's well said and a good summary of what we hope to do. But I would just add that we kind of want to lend clarity to this culture war question. And when I say clarity, I mean we want to place it in a political context. Like you say, we want to, as we often do in the Praxis Report, we want to re-inject politics into politics. In other words, we don't want these cultural issues to be simply a question of some kind of reproductive definition, like in the case of abortion, or some kind of, I don't know, definition on bullet magazines in terms of the gun issue.
Right. Or a matter of theology or metaphysics over when,
right, or even medicine.
Medicine, yeah, right.
Right. We want to inject politics to understand. Well, how does reproduction fit in a sort of a political method to define what is a liberal or libertarian view? What is a Marxian or socialist view? How does it fit into politics as we properly understand it, as opposed to what you're discussing, this sort of vague, abstract, and ambiguous notion that we call culture? And we'll get into that.
Yeah. So that's very well said. And like we kind of we're going to focus on abortion because abortion is an issue that's been a hot button topic in American life for 40 or 50 years. And in recent weeks and months, the issue of abortion has, the debate around that topic has reignited when a draft of a Supreme Court ruling was leaked to the press, which showed that they were planning to overturn potentially Roe v. Wade, which would then kick the abortion rights issue back to each individual state. And this, of course, has led liberals to focus on the way that women will then be denied the right to choose an abortion. And this has become a huge issue in the Democratic Party, where they plan on focusing on this to help their electoral chances in November. But before we really get into the question of abortion, we really do need to talk about why the Supreme Court made the decision that it did in Roe v. Wade all those years ago. So, William, would you want to shed some light on
Sure. I'll just try to briefly review the Roe v. Wade case, because that's the precedent-setting case that led to this 50-year-long political battle over reproduction and so forth. The case is important and precedent-setting simply because it established what the jurists would describe as a right to privacy, using a kind of a unique legal method that the justices used in that case. It's called the Penumbra Theory. And that's a theory where the justices took a series of fundamental rights found in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, and kind of combined them together to create a right to privacy, and making the argument that certain aspects of reproduction are private affairs, and that the state has no right to intervene in what is a right to privacy. Now, I might also point out that around the world, modern states sort of actually codify a right to privacy within their constitutions, that there are certain matters of individual privacy that a state may not interfere with. But our Constitution, the American Constitution, was written so long ago that the founders did not incorporate a right to privacy. So what we call the living Constitution, the idea that you have to sort of update the Constitution to bring it in line with modern values and modern ideas, the justices use this theory of combining several fundamental rights to create a right to privacy. And those rights are, for example, the Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures, this idea that the government can't break into your house and start searching for things. That's the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. That's one of the fundamental rights the court brought in. Another is the Fifth and 14th Amendments, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is liberty? That's a great question. As my old constitutional law professor used to say, liberty is however the justices define it at a certain point of time. So liberty, and what we consider liberty, fundamental to a person's freedom, changes over time. What was a liberty right today may not have been a liberty right back in 1776 or the 19th, early 19th century. Liberty has changed with the mores and values of the time, and so the justices in the Roe v. Wade case took the position that liberty encompassed a woman's right to choose, and during the first trimester of her pregnancy, whether she wanted to have an abortion or carry the pregnancy to term. This was her private liberty right, implied by the Constitution. Now, the court in that case struck down a state law which tried to interfere in that woman's liberty right, private right to decide, in this case, to have a therapeutic abortion during the first trimester. Now, the case gets complicated, and back to this question that you raised earlier, John, about the problems with abortion as a political question, because it begins to degenerate. The case degenerates into a complex analysis over first, second, and third trimesters of pregnancy. And what the court sort of does is, in a complex manner, depoliticizing the question, basically saying, well, as the pregnancy goes on, the state has more and more of an interest in passing rules and regulations regarding the pregnancy as the fetus develops more into a human being. So in other words, the state's right to intervene and say, no, you can't have an abortion at a certain stage because it's not medically healthy for the fetus or for the woman, say in the third trimester of the pregnancy. The state has a legitimate state interest reasonably related to the public health to regulate, to say, you can't have an abortion in the 8th month of your pregnancy, but it's your absolute liberty right as a human being to have an abortion during the first 90 days of the pregnancy. So again, as the pregnancy wears on, the legal protections wear off in a sense. But I think the important point here is that this is essentially, on one level, a struggle for the right to privacy, which makes it kind of in terms of politics, a type of privatization, if you will, of maybe the broader political question. And that's something I'd like to get into, John.
That's the important thing, I think, that I take away from Roe v. Wade, is that it provides the basis for woman's right to choose to have an abortion on the basis of privacy, which is then sort of a negative right. It's like saying that the state cannot intervene in your private decision. But the consequence of that, I think, that is very important, is that it does not mean that the state has a positive obligation to provide abortions or access to abortions for women. So one of the most immediate issues is, can the state federally fund abortion procedures through Medicaid, through Medicare, so something like that? And a big question is, of course, typically the answer is no. When Jimmy Carter was president, he actually was the first president to enact a ban on the use of federal tax dollars, public funds, to pay for abortion services. And when he was interviewed by the press, his response was, well, life is not fair. If you're a poor woman, you won't be able to get an abortion because you don't have the money to pay for it. You don't have health insurance. If you're a wealthy woman, you can get an abortion. And that is sort of an illustration of what the abortion debate is that if the Supreme Court frames it on the basis of privacy, then it is an individualistic question. It is not a question of social obligation. It is not a question of public funds. And of course, another way that this is relevant is that when we're arguing about healthcare in this country, and we talk about universal healthcare, Medicare for all, one of the aspects of universal healthcare is that reproductive rights, abortion, and other services would be provided by the state, would be covered. So then in that case, abortion would be more of a positive social right or social obligation, whereas now under Roe v. Wade, it has been reduced to an individual privacy question. And I think that's why it becomes part of the culture war, because if it's an individual matter, then what we are reduced to is this endless debate that is down to a kind of theological question about when does life begin? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin when the child is born? Is there some a certain trimester in the pregnancy? And that's a metaphysical question that you can't really resolve because it has to do with things that are not politics. They're not political questions. It's a religious question or a morality question.
Right.
But they've removed from the entire table the political question by privatizing abortion in such a manner.
Right. It does, and it again, it's so important because we've addressed this in our prior podcast on coronavirus, which is what the problem. By the way, how you described it is brilliant, and that is how you described it is the problem, because you've taken the politics out of the abortion question by privatizing it in this fashion. What is the politics of it? Well, the politics is this broader question that we discussed with regard to the coronavirus. The politics of it is public health in America. Is there a public health system? Is there universal health care in America? And poor women can't afford abortions. Poor people can't afford health care. 30 million Americans have no health insurance, not only for abortions, but for cancer and hypertension and diabetes and every other form of ailment.
Yeah.
So, or problem.
Right.
So it's not it is a woman's question in the sense that it affects a woman's health. And we can get into that a little bit too later, because this is another aspect of the issue. In other words, is this a struggle for women's rights, women being a gender class that are historically subjugated? True. And the state intervening to protect the rights of a subjugated class, namely women. However, that's where you might deprivatize the question a bit. But the criticism still holds that the question is never discussed as a question of universal healthcare, a struggle of working people to have great healthcare in every avenue: men healthcare, women healthcare, urological healthcare for men, reproductive healthcare for women, healthcare for cancer and heart disease and everything else, and the coronavirus as well.
And to go to that question too, the way that abortion is framed, I kind of find it unhelpful right now, because the classic way it's framed in America is pro-choice versus pro-life. And if you really start thinking about those things, well, who wouldn't want to be pro-life? And who wouldn't want to be pro-choice? We want people to have the ability to make choices, and we want to protect life. So I think from my perspective, like looking in the history of Marxist theory on this topic has been illuminating. And just quickly, I want to cite one of the famous theorists in the Soviet Union, Alexandra Kollontai, who wrote about the women's question in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. And she had a very interesting article about abortion, because the first country that fully legalized abortion, I believe, was the Soviet Union. And she kind of argues in favor that if you outlaw abortion, of course, it's going to still, the bourgeois women, the wealthy women will still have access to it, but the poor women, the working women, will not. So the Soviet Union legalized it and made it a part of the maternity question, the reproductive question, and medical question that was fully taken care of by the state. However, she does say something really interesting, which is that she says, even though we legalize abortion, we don't think abortion is just an unlimited good that we think everyone should just go out and have abortions whenever they want. So she recognizes that there is sort of some negative social consequences to it. And she argues that, the need for abortion will only disappear when there is broad prosperity throughout the entire working class, that the underlying cause of not wanting to keep a pregnancy will no longer exist. And she also concludes by saying that she thinks childbirth itself is a social obligation, a positive social obligation. And I find that very interesting because, in my view, that sort of bridges the divide between the conservative and liberal position we have today of pro-life and pro-choice, by arguing that even if you do think that creating life and reproducing is a positive social obligation so that the human species can continue, we do want to protect abortion regardless, because if you eliminate the freedom of abortion, it will only oppress women who are particularly poor women. And I think that's the reason we can't get to that point in the United States, is because, like you said, Will, Roe v. Wade is sort of an obstacle. It only looks at abortion from a privacy question, doesn't look at the public health obligation, social obligation question to abortion. And so maybe if we were able to theorize that question in such a way, we could transcend this pro-life versus pro-choice debate entirely.
Yeah, it's again brilliant. That's a brilliant summation. I read some research, John. Maybe you could help out with this. That the Soviet Union in the modern period actually encouraged, at one point, I think during the 50s or 60s, women, bringing pregnancies to term, because it was in the interest of the state to do that, and the state would want to do that if at all possible. In other words, sort of I don't know if it was a play to religious theological ideas. It might have been in part, but I think it was just the idea that the idea of public health, that what's in the public interest, what's in the public health, bringing pregnancies to term, or permitting free access to abortion at any time. In other words, the answer is not one that clearly belongs on the right or the left, on the libertarian or the socialist idea. I mean, in other words, if anything, the way we analyze the issue here, it takes that question, and I don't know if I'm describing this properly, but it sort of takes the politics out of the question.
Yeah, and another thing I think that's an important aspect of this question is that the Democrats really like the fact that Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court decision rather than a sort of decision that was made through the popular will of the people. And the reason I say that is because every 4 years, there's a new presidential election. And one of the main issues that they focus on is that who is going to get elected will appoint justices to the Supreme Court that can therefore either, for Republicans, overturn Roe v. Wade, or for Democrats, protect Roe v. Wade. So that the Democrats and the Republicans both use that as part of this two-party back and forth in their electoral campaigns. And Democrats use it as a lesser evil argument. If Trump wins, he's going to appoint people, so we need Biden in here so he can appoint. And that is one reason why leaving this question up to the Supreme Court in and of itself is a reactionary set of politics, because
it's a retreat. Yeah. It's a retreat from politics.
It's a retreat. Yeah. It takes it out of the question of the public interest, the public and the will of the people. And so, not that I'm saying returning the question to the states is necessarily reflecting the will of the people either, but I think the proper solution from a socialist perspective would be to include the abortion, or to provide abortion through public health, public medicine, but also through transforming society, through improving the material conditions of society, through eliminating poverty and all these other questions. It will kind of reduce the need to have an abortion in the first place. And that's what I don't think Roe v. Wade does.
Right. And I also, from a liberal perspective, just a pro-democracy perspective, these are political questions. In other words, the public's health is a sort of a political issue that the public should be involved in. Because I think about the question, not just about, at what what point in the pregnancy trimesters the state has a right to intervene. I think of it more as a public health question about sex, marriage, families, and children. And if you begin to think of it in a broader context, this question is part of a broader family policy question, a political question about the American family. There's good reason to analyze the question that way. In some of the research I did on this, we have something like 400, almost 500,000 children, like 400 and something thousand children in foster care. So these are children, unwanted children, who are wards now of the state, who have no parents. And what is done with these children? Well, that's a public health question that is part and parcel of this whole question of reproduction, childbirth, children, and their rearing, and how is that going to be done? That's just one aspect of it.
That's a very important aspect too.
Another aspect is the adoption question.
Right.
Adopting a child. Very, very, for all the focus on whether abortion should be protected in the first versus the third trimester of a pregnancy, the whole question of adoption, what happens after the pregnancy. Very difficult to adopt a child in the United States. It costs tens of thousands of dollars. It's a process that requires the hiring of lawyers. It's a process that takes, they say, up to a year and a half to actually pull it off. It's almost impossible to do given the legal and the financial hurdles that a person or a couple have to overcome to adopt and raise a child. In the meantime, you have, again, this 400,000 plus children in foster care who need homes. And you have this question, you have this pro-life movement that's saying, no, let's promote life and bring pregnancies to term without state interference. But what about the foster care system? What about a legal adoption in America? Almost impossible to do, or it's possible, but you got to be wealthy. I mean, you got to hire lawyers. It costs tens of thousands of dollars. So you have to look at the question, I think, much more politically. And that's why I think we do a disservice when we bring it down to a question of some kind of private legal right in the first 90 days of a pregnancy.
Well, I think you're touching on a good aspect of why the Republican position does appeal to certain people, is that they correctly present themselves as they believe in the value of life, the family, parenting, motherhood, childhood, etc. And I think those are in reality, those are positive things. We want families. We want people to be able to have children. We want people to have the freedom and the security and safety and support to raise healthy families and healthy children. And of course, the Republicans are incapable of providing that, because the reason that families aren't being raised isn't because it didn't start with Roe v. Wade. It's not the crazy, abortion laws and feminists that are taking away the ability of the family. But as Marx and Engels pointed out 150 years ago, capitalism itself undermines the family. The traditional patriarchal family of feudalism is being torn apart by the ravages of capitalism. That is making it so that it's harder and harder and harder for a nuclear family to survive, to afford kids, to raise children in this world. And even harder now with the Biden economy that is really driving up the price of goods for everyone. So even if Republicans are bringing up important topics like the family and marriage and children, we need to go beyond what Republicans can offer, because they really don't offer any solution other than this vague promise to return to a traditional way of life and traditional values.
Right. So the Republicans are correct to raise the issue of family values and family life, but like so many Republican issues, they have the right sort of diagnosis, or they've targeted on the right question. And they have all the wrong solutions because they don't solve the problem of the American family today. And I was just doing some research.
That's right. I agree with that.
Back in the 1960s, something like 9% of American families were single family heads of household, where a sole parent would be raising a child. That was back in 1960.
Yeah.
Today, it's approaching a third of all families are raised by a single family parent head of household, which means that almost we're approaching 28% is the actual stat, but we're approaching a third of American families are literally on the brink of poverty, homelessness, and God knows what's happening to the children who are being raised living on the brink of hunger, poverty, and homelessness.
And that's why the liberal individualism about choice and privacy and those individualistic phrases that doesn't address those things. It basically just says,
you have the private right to carry your pregnancy to term, so that your child will be born hungry and in a single family household on the verge of homelessness every second.
Right. Because again, liberalism it politicizes certain aspects of the question, like the privacy aspect, and depoliticizes the social obligation of the state and of society and of the capitalist class to provide for the safety and security of the working class, which has been completely wiped out over the last several decades.
Right. So we really need to. I think it's correct to talk about this question in terms of these bigger issues that Republicans primarily raise, which is marriage, sex, marriage, and families. But we should do it in a proper political way. And the Democrats do not do that. Liberals don't do that. They privatize it as a liberty right, sort of a women's rights issue, as opposed to a broader issue of the health of American families and the public health. And that's most unfortunate.
Yeah,
because the politics is taken out once again of the question.
Well,
and by the way, we live in the modern period. We do need to focus on sex and marriage and these sorts of things, because if marriages are breaking up and people are being raised in single family heads of households with children on the verge of homelessness and poverty, or being in a foster care system with no parents, abandoned. We do have the state does have an interest in promoting healthy relationships, healthy marriages, and healthy families. We need to redefine in the modern era, because we live in the era where of LGBT, of same-sex couples, of polymorphism versus all sorts of new forms of family. That's fine, but we do need to refocus on family values, the health of the American family, and this question of sex, marriage, and reproduction. I was going to say, interesting. I don't want to sidetrack it. Interesting little tidbit in Germany. There was a proposal called it's like limited marriage, where the state grants a marriage license to a couple for 7 years, 7-year marriage, the 7-year itch, so to speak, and then the couple, it's incumbent upon them to renew the marriage license. So in other words, that's Germany. That's a sort of
that's good. That's good. Well, but I think you're getting at is a good point that we have to then question what is the family, what function, what social role does that serve? And from the standpoint of class society,
right,
family reproduces the workers. So the capitalists need workers to create commodities that generate profit. And in order for workers to do that, they have to reproduce their own life. So they have to go home from work, they have to rest, they have to eat, they have to go to bed, they have to wake up the next day and be strong enough to go back to work. And then eventually workers die, they get old and die. So then you need new workers, so you need new babies to be born. So the family is the capitalist way of outsourcing their responsibility onto the individual family unit to engage in that aspect of social reproduction. And what you're saying is that the capitalist class and the state, which is owned by the capitalist class, is failing in their responsibility to provide a context in which reproduction can occur in a healthy and productive way. Regardless of whether it's a single household or multi-families, there's all new arrangements and different genders and identities, but the basic question for me, at least, is the fact that there's the inability to support a family is a major sign of capitalism being in a state of crisis. that it just cannot even reproduce itself at this point because of the
Right.
austerity
And
that it's
again,
imposed.
the issue is so important because, again, I don't think people analyze this question as, well, therefore I'm a Marxist or a theologian or am I a fundamentalist Christian or religious Jew or am I a Marxist revolutionary? I mean, they just think about it as, sex, marriage, children. And it's probably the most personal, important decision that an individual thinks about. It's like politics on steroids, because this is
Yeah,
this is your this is probably closer
it's
to you than any other aspect of life itself.
it's your
And this
family,
is
it's your home. Yeah,
reproduction of the species, for God's sake.
right.
So that's what we're talking about here. And
Well,
what is it? That's the biological imperative of all life, reproduction.
right. Yeah.
So yeah, of course,
Well, we
people are going
should.
to think about this more than, am I a Republican or a
Yeah.
Democrat or a
Well, we should.
fundamentalist
We
or
should. We should. And we should tie this. I think we should try to tie this to the other big cultural issue right now, which is the gun control debate,
correct.
because that also, a lot of it revolves around the question of children, particularly because the most recent mass shooting took place in a school, elementary school in Texas, and the big debate, of course, now is how to resolve that. And we can talk about gun control, whether we believe that it is justified to have the unrestricted access to guns that we have in America. Typically, they also will talk about mental health. They'll talk about violence in movies and TV shows and stuff. But I think my perspective would be that those things are sort of uh, a they're kind of more like looking at the surface level of the causal chain, in the chain of events that would lead to a mass shooting or to gun violence in general, because we have to also remember most shootings that occur are not mass shootings. They are individual single act of violence or suicide, which is
Suicide, right?
extremely high. But
Right.
uh, I think in general, gun control, we have to think, I think, in two things. One would be from a Marxist perspective, you have Mao's famous quote that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And so in a revolutionary context, perhaps we would be opposed to disarming the working class because they need the arms to overthrow the state and build a socialist society. However, once the Chinese Communist Party took power and proclaimed the revolution successful, today the Chinese Communist Party does have a highly restricted access to guns and far less gun violence than the United States. I mean, people in China look at the United States and think of it as like the Wild West with the amount of shootings. So I think, to me, my perspective on gun violence would be that in order to convince most Americans to disarm would require there to be a greater level of trust in society, trust in one another as individuals, trust in the state as an institution that can protect our lives, and a decrease in crime. Because you're not going to convince most Americans to say, let's give up your guns when there's a massive high crime rate, when the state is in complete disarray, when the police are brutalizing people. So I think the reason why gun control measures can work better in a place like China today is because China, 80, 90, 95% of the people support and trust their government. Whereas in the United States, 90% of the people can't stand the government. So of course, you're not going to convince someone who fears and distrusts the government and the rest of society to give up their arms. And I think a lot of people, when they hear liberals say, let's ban guns, they feel that way, that you're taking away my gun. That's the only weapon I have to protect myself from the mishigas in the world out there. And you Democrats aren't doing anything to stop the craziness, to stop the crime, to stop the state, all that stuff. So perhaps looking at a deeper systematic level of trust in society might be one of the reasons for the gun violence.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. How you define that. I agree. I think public safety and personal security. I mean, just like again, this question of reproduction. It's just the most basic concern of every individual, and they don't think of these things in terms of, would that make me a Marxist or does that make me a libertarian? I mean, they just want to be secure in their person and they want to be safe and not be gunned down. I mean, So yeah, that's all true. Again, we want to point out, I think, some of the basic. If you look at the stats on this question, it's just incredible. I have something they say 5 children daily are killed by gun violence. 111 people overall killed daily.
Yeah.
Incredible amounts of mass annual killings, over 40,000 killed annually by gun violence. You know, you know, 10 times, 8 times, 7 times more than any other industrialized country, Australia, France, Germany. So just on the basic facts, yeah, we're pretty much a very uncivilized sort of place. But I think
Yeah.
you're right. I think countries that have established public institutions that earn in which the individual feels confident in, that public institutions that have credibility, those societies are better able to protect public health and safety and personal security, and therefore enact things like gun licensing and other civilized approaches to this thing.
Well,
Um,
we just have
that
such
we can't.
a we have so many people in this country who are so deeply alienated and depressed and disaffected and disillusioned with everything. And so it's not a great leap for someone like that to want to go out with a bang, so to speak, and take the whole world out with them. And you know that classic quote from the rabbinic tradition: the sword comes into the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. So we could apply that to guns. You know, the fact that there is such deep injustice and deep problems of alienation in our society leads to a sort of psychosis where guns become the only answer. And another thing that I think we should talk about, Will, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, is do you think that the gun culture and the gun debate in America is fueled by the fact that America itself is also an imperialist power that
Mm.
spends billions and trillions on weapons of war, on militarism, on aggression abroad? Do you think that has sort of any effect on the home front when it comes to gun violence?
Well, it just, this is a question. This is a great question. I mean, I think, on first glance, on first impression, it would be pretty hard to argue in favor of a strict regime of gun restriction and gun licensing and so forth on the one hand, while on the other hand promoting the largest military death killing war machine, the defense industry budget in the history of the planet Earth. I mean,
Right.
it's
It's a
such a
contradiction.
contradiction
Yeah.
that it becomes almost impossible to sustain this. In other words, either we're a society engaged in primarily the project of peace and democracy throughout the world, or we're not. We're a society that promotes violence and killing throughout the world, and therefore the society just simply reflects what we're doing throughout the world. So I think, yeah, I've never thought about that question, but that would be my first impression.
And I think I totally agree. And also, like, let's talk about the electoral politics aspect of gun control. Do you
That's
think, yeah.
critical here.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that that's an important question? The Democratic Party, I know Beto O'Rourke was kind of he's running in Texas where the shooting happened, and he's been pushing all these political stunts where he goes and
Right.
demands gun reforms and things. Do you think that that's a question that the Democratic Party is equipped to address and resolve?
I don't think so, because the irony of the question is, like the pundits, the progressive pundits often celebrate. If you look at the polls, most people want responsible gun ownership, and the polls all show the need for. And yet, in mass, the public overwhelmingly elects these sort of right-wing Republicans that just completely oppose any form of gun restriction, gun regulation, gun licensing, or anything else. And then also you have that other problem we talked about with regard to abortion. It gets sort of mystified in this debate over should we ban handguns or assault rifles or some other kind of magazines, or should we have a gun show loophole? It becomes so complex that you lose the thrust of it, which is this, I guess, this kind of what you described earlier, this discussion about personal security and public safety and the faith we have in our institutions to keep us safe and alive. So no, I don't think the Democrats are equipped, because the public is sort of hypocritical. They on the one hand call or overwhelmingly support responsible gun ownership regulations and licensing and education and all of this sort of thing, which in short, gun controls, government, state regulations of the gun industry, of the manufacturing industry, or the weapons manufacturing industry on the one hand, and yet continue to vote almost popularly for politicians that oppose any kind of gun regulation or restriction whatsoever.
Right.
So the Democrats are not, what the Democrats appear to be doing, to me, again, depoliticizing the issue, taking the politics out of it, making an argument over what is it? Bullet magazines versus assault and handguns, or I don't know, hunting rifles and other kinds of weaponry, or as opposed to a much more important and broader political question.
So they were kind of like a technocratic debate over this versus that. Can we have this type of gun but not this, and rather than getting to the substantive issue.
Yeah, the true political issue, which is the Americans overwhelmingly, on one hand, support responsible gun ownership. I hate that term, but because I would ban all, the whole, personally. I think the whole thing's nuts. I mean, it's just, what kind of a society do you have? What is it? 5 kids a day murdered, and what is it? 111 people gunned down every day. 10 times what Australia has, or 8 times what France has, and it's insane. And they don't have you got to get a driver's license to drive a car and pass a test and do all this to drive a car, but you can buy some kind of weapon, and you don't have to take a test or pass a health exam or something. It's just crazy, but still it remains politically that people vote overwhelmingly for a political leadership that opposes all form of gun restriction and regulation because of this concern in the public about public health and safety and security and so forth, and the lack of faith in our political institutions. And a lack of faith in each other, because we don't have something called social, what you might call, John, social solidarity.
Right.
We're a private country with private interests, and we act privately. So of course we all need to arm ourselves to
go back to like the pro-life thing. If you're pro-life, you let's say you protect your own life. You want to defend yourself, your family, your children. And you look at the world and you distrust your fellow man and woman. You just trust your brothers and sisters, your fellow countrymen. You just trust the state. You just trust the big institutions, the businesses, the media. You just trust everybody. You see criminals and threats. And so guns, that's the only thing you have to defend yourself, right?
Right.
And so unless there is a advancement to build back that social solidarity and to make the institutions in America actually responsive to the people's needs, I don't think it's going to be very easy to convince people by arguing about gun stats or arguing about magazine sizes, like you were saying. I think the way to attack it would be to focus on the underlying conditions that are causing it instead, the underlying conditions that cause people to feel the need for guns in the first place, rather than just ban everyone's guns, which then, makes people threatened.
So, John, let me ask you this question. I'd be interested to hear your answer. Have we, in a sense, privatized these questions? Privatized the questions of, sex, marriage, and birth, and privatized the questions of personal safety and security to the point that we lose the politics of these issues completely?
Oh, yeah. That's exactly excellent way of phrasing it, Will. I think because if we look at America, and America is a capitalist society, it's the U.S. empire that is it's engaged in the project of reducing all political questions to kind of mystify them by making them a cultural debate. And culture in this sense means ideas, whether you believe in guns or you don't believe in guns, whether you believe in abortion or you believe in life at conception. And so there's no class struggle behind that. It's just the realm of debating metaphysical ideas about whether it's right or wrong. And I think that benefits the capitalist class, and it benefits the military industrial complex, that the weapons manufacturers in the United States, to have political questions reduced to cultural questions rather than class questions.
So it's pretty hard to, I think, getting back to your original question about our foreign policy and our massive military budgets and the weapons that we produce to fight endless wars around the planet. It's pretty hard to have that on the one hand and a safe domestic society on the other. The two are in contradiction. So
I think they definitely are. And yeah, like as a Marxist, I would just think in general, the culture wars, it's a way for the capitalist elites to mystify class struggle, because as we've been talking just on these two issues alone, on guns and abortion, we can point out an underlying class issue that is behind both of those debates, but the class issues are eliminated from the broad discussion, or as you would say, the politics, the class politics behind those questions is eliminated from the public discourse. So all we're left with is this cultural war. And just personally, I'm kind of tired of it. I'm tired. Like my whole life, every election, we've had guns and abortion. That's over and over again,
right.
And not a single thing has changed.
That hasn't changed since the election cycle, starting with Dick Nixon in the 60s, in 1968. That the culture war was introduced by Nixon under the phrase acid amnesty and abortion. Then the issue was the draft, which has since been privatized, which is another issue we might want to get into in a future show.
Yeah,
acid being drugs and then abortion.
Don't they also have the Republicans say the 3 Gs, the guns, God, and gays, or something like that?
Guns, God, and gays. Yeah.
So it's kind of, but in a healthy and sane society, people would be able to agree and disagree over cultural questions and moral questions and metaphysical and religious questions. But I think that we shouldn't think of guns and abortion, and it shouldn't primarily be metaphysical or moral questions. They should be political questions. Should be questions of class struggle, not just leaving them up to this endless debate that never resolves itself.
Or a question of these broader questions of, again, public health and safety and so forth. In other words, broader public questions that belong in the democratic sphere, as opposed to privatized rights.
Yes. So abortion and guns, both privatized questions, cultural questions, to mystify the underlying politics behind them.
Correct. That's a good summation. I think of the way to end the segment.
Yeah. Well, we'll have future episodes and we'll discuss in more detail how do we move forward beyond the culture wars. But I think we've done a pretty good job on these two topics alone in the time we had.
That was a good analysis, John. Really
you too.
Informative and really interesting. So
you too, man. You too.
That. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for listening. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown.
And I'm your co-host, William Barth.
And we've been the Praxis Report. See you next time.
Next episode.